Okay.
All right.
And I'll start sharing the screen after you've introduced me, I think, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I think we'll give it a little while longer, and then we'll get started.
Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. We hope you're enjoying the conference so far. Welcome to the Women in Healthcare. Sorry?
No, you have to still admit people. Sorry.
Yeah, there's still in the waiting room.
Hold on, I got it.
Me and Zoom, best friends.
Zoom is so great.
All right, I see a few people coming in, so we'll give it another minute or so and then get started.
Okay. And we're aiming to finish by about 1:45, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I've tried to keep this short. So yeah, I'll try and monitor the time myself.
All right. Hi, everyone. We hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. Welcome to the Women in Healthcare Then and Now workshop. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore the social history of health and medicine for female health workers in the Anglophone Caribbean through the late 19th and earlier 20th century. So just a couple of reminders about decorum. We are a small group today, so it shouldn't be a problem, but just a reminder, during the presentation, everyone's mics and cameras should be off, and we will keep the chat function open. So if Dr. Barros asks a question, you can answer it in the chat, or if you have other questions, you can leave them there as well. Then we'll reopen all functions for all attendees on Zoom during the Q&A portion of the workshop, where we'll have the floor open for discussion and question and answer. So at that point, feel free to turn your camera on, raise your hand to ask a question, or to type your question into the chat. So I'm very pleased to present today's workshop speaker, Dr. Juanita Barros, who is a professor at the Department of History at McMaster University and an affiliate of McMaster's Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition. Dr. Barros specializes in urban history, gender, the history of childhood, and the social history of health and medicine. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Barros.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction. So I'm right now just going to share the screen so you can see the PowerPoints that I've got set up. So, and I'm actually just going to move the little row of faces so I can see what's going on. Okay. So can you all see the PowerPoint? Good. I see heads nodding. Okay, fantastic. Excellent. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm glad that you're attending this session, and I see that we're a pretty small group. Maybe it'll get a bit bigger, but if not, this will provide some opportunity, I think, for maybe a bit of a conversation about some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So it's really great to be part of such an important event, and I'd really like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And I think this is a really nice opportunity to bring a Caribbean element to International Women's Day and to talk about the history of women's experiences in the healthcare field in the Caribbean. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. So first of all, I mean, you can see by the slide, I've given my little presentation a title, Historical Perspectives on Gender and Medicine in the Caribbean. And I'm just kind of curious if you can even just, respond by chat. When you see this title, what immediately comes to your mind? I mean, are there any initial associations that you have, or what your expectations are of a topic like this? And I'll just give a minute to see if anybody wants to respond by chat. If you don't, that's okay. I'll just kind of launch into what I'm talking about. But I'm just kind of curious as to what you think you're going to hear when you see a title like that. And as I tell my students, there are no wrong, well, okay, sometimes there are wrong answers actually, but there are no bad answers. Okay, nobody's trying. Okay, so let me just get going then. Okay, so what I'm going to be focusing on in this talk is as you know, fits International Women's Day and the theme of this conference, there are female health workers in the Anglophone Caribbean. And so in the talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados, the places I've done most of my research on, but I'll talk about a few other places as well. And the time period I'm going to be talking about is the late 19th and early 20th century. And in a couple of minutes, you'll see why this time period is so important. But what I'm going to also try and do is to put some of these Caribbean developments into a larger context, because as you'll see, the developments in healthcare and women's place in the healthcare system in the Anglophone Caribbean was not especially unique. We can see similar patterns in other places in the world in this time period. So before we sort of get into the real material here, let me make a couple of comments about the context. So number one, important to know, the places I'm talking about today, these are all colonies. So what does that mean? They were British colonies. And so the British government, which was the imperial center for places like Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana and Barbados, had a lot of power over economic and political life. Not total power, but a lot of power. So that's point number one that's important to know. Point number two, the time period that we're talking about is the post-slavery period. So in the Caribbean, as you probably know, there was a system of enslavement in which people of African descent were forcibly enslaved and forced to work on plantations. By the time we're talking about, this system of enslavement had finished. It had ended, I don't know, 50, 60 years, something like that previously. And so slavery in the Anglophone Caribbean ended in 1838. The third thing that we want to know, and this is the third point of context, is that this was an extremely ethnically diverse area. So people who don't know much about the Caribbean probably think that it's peopled mostly by people of African descent. And of course, people of African descent comprise a significant part of the population. In some islands, the majority of the population, but in other territories, there's people of other ethnic backgrounds. So people of Indian, so South Asian ancestry, and the place where my family is from, Guyana, people of South Asian ancestry make up about half the population. Trinidad, it's around half, maybe a little bit more than half. I always get the numbers mixed up. People of Chinese ancestry, people of Portuguese ancestry, which is how my family ended up in the Caribbean, and then people from other European areas. So it's an extremely diverse area. So this is important to know. Okay, so in this brief presentation, I'm going to talk about nurses and midwives, who they were, how they were trained, the kind of medical roles that they played. And I'm also going to talk about so-called granny midwives, that is women who had informal training. That is, they hadn't studied in any kind of a formal medical training establishment, but they were still important healthcare workers. What I'm also going to do, though, because I'm a historian, I'm a history professor, as Madeline noted in the introduction, I'm also going to talk about how we know about these women's stories. So where we get information about their lives and their work. And we'll see that even though sources about women's experiences in the past can be scarce and are extremely problematic, they show us that these women played crucial roles in the development of public health and medical institutions in this part of the world. I mean, these women really were the frontline workers of their day. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind. I see that there are a couple of responses in the chat. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, great. I'm not sure what to expect, but I'm sure it'll be interesting. Thanks so much, Christine. I hope I won't disappoint you. Okay. So, all right. So the first section, in this brief presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about medical training in the colonial world more broadly, just to give us a sense of the larger context. Okay, so, and again, I'm just sort of curious as to what you think when you hear these topics. So when I say medical training in the colonial world, do you have any preconceptions, any ideas about what that may have involved in the past? Or do you actually have any prior knowledge of this? Again, just sort of curious to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have prior knowledge on this, but I'm assuming that it would mostly be males in the past who have sort of medical training. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a really important point. When we're talking about physicians, absolutely, right? So when we're talking about formally trained healthcare workers who worked as physicians in the period that we're talking about, that's mostly men. So that's an excellent point. Anyone else want to give this a shot? Okay, so the period that we're talking about, so it's roughly, the late 19th to the early 20th century, so roughly the 1880s to the 1920s. This was a really important period in the history of medicine, sort of more broadly, not only in the Caribbean, but internationally. So in this period, we see dramatic developments in the field of medicine, growing government attention to public healthcare problems or public health problems like sanitation, for example. We see the increasing professionalization and specialization of health workers, the development of training institutions, and we see new and changing ideas about the nature of disease and disease causation. And so historians actually who work on the topic of the social history of health and medicine, they refer to the second half of the 19th century as a period when we see a revolution in healthcare. And it sounds like a dramatic phrase, but it's really quite accurate. And so if you think about it, many of the ways that we understand healthcare today and the role of healthcare professionals, it sort of gets its beginning in the period that we're talking about. So this is a super important period. So healthcare workers, obviously, or health workers obviously played a really important role in all of these areas. So they cared for sick people, of course. They implemented government policies, so they implemented public health policies. They often gave advice to governments. And so as I said at the beginning, they, and especially women, were really at the frontline workers of their time. There were different groups of healthcare workers in the past, just as there are today. And so in the pandemic that we're living in right now, I mean, we've all had, like, even if people who may not know very much about the healthcare field, we've all had a bit of a crash course into the different kinds of healthcare workers that are out there. So in the past as well, there were often very different groups of healthcare workers. And I'm just going to say a couple of words about physicians. They're not the main group in our story about the Caribbean. And the point that was just made a couple of minutes ago, most physicians in the period that we're talking about were male. It's kind of the explanation for that. So in the time period that we're talking about, anyone who wanted to become a physician had to attend medical school. Most people who lived in colonized parts of the world, so the Caribbean, for example, or colonized Africa, and who wanted to become doctors, had to travel outside of their home territories to do so. So that's important for us to know. There weren't medical schools in colonized Africa in the period we're talking about. There weren't medical schools in the Anglophone Caribbean. There were medical schools in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but not in places like Jamaica and Guyana and Barbados. We don't see the development of medical schools in the Anglophone Caribbean until the late 1940s. So if a person wanted to become a doctor and they're Jamaican, they had to go someplace else. And so the places they had to go were the UK, for example. So the University of Edinburgh Medical School was one of the main destinations for Caribbean and African doctors as well. Many of them also had to attend the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, or many chose to. So these were a couple of the main places where people went to study medicine. They also, if they were of African descent and they were from the Caribbean, they could also go to some of the historically Black medical schools in the United States, so like Howard University, for example. And some people studied in Canada, so Queen's University and McGill are a couple of the examples that I've run into. Some of these people from the Caribbean who wanted to become doctors were of African or South Asian ancestry, and they, not surprisingly, faced considerable racism in their efforts to study medicine and become physicians. So we see this everywhere, actually, but some dramatic examples in Canada where Queen's University, which had allowed Afro-Caribbean medical students to study, after the late 1910s, decided no, they weren't going to allow any more Black students in. And so that's sort of one of the dramatic examples that we have. As was pointed out a couple of minutes ago, most of these doctors were men. So we know, or researchers know that historically significant obstacles were placed in the path of women who wanted to attend medical school. And so one great and incredibly disturbing quotation I ran into from 1871, Alfred Stile, he was the president of the American Medical Association, and I'm going to quote him now. He said that women were, and I'm quoting, were, quote, unfitted by nature to be physicians because of their, quote, uncertainty of rational judgment, and capriciousness of sentiment, fickleness of purpose, and indecision of action, which totally unfit women for professional pursuits. Okay, that's what Alfred had to say. He was clearly wrong. And when we listen to something like this, we think, wow, that's nuts, right? But that kind of sentiment, that kind of perspective was widely held in the period that we're talking about. On the other hand, though, some people, some physicians, some members of government and members of the elites thought, in fact, that Alfred was wrong, and that women could be doctors, but they should only be doctors if they were tending to other women and children, because that was thought to be appropriate and women's part of women's natural role, looking after other women and looking after children. By the late 19th century, some medical schools in North America and Britain were starting to allow women to attend medical school. And so theoretically, Caribbean women could have attended these medical schools like Caribbean men if they had the money and if they were admitted. But hardly any of them did. And it's maybe not surprising because there's so few women in medical school in this period, and the obstacles were really pretty great. But so in the period that we're talking about, there are hardly any Caribbean women who attended medical school. So in Jamaica, for example, in 1921, I found 2 female physicians in the census out of a total of 138. 2 women out of a total of 138. In the census in Guyana, I found 0. In the census in Barbados, I found 0. That's not very many women at all. And in fact, in all the research I've been doing on health and medicine and healthcare workers in the Anglophone Caribbean, I've only found 1 female physician in the period that I've been working on. And her name was Ethel Minette. I tried to find a picture of her for the slide, but I couldn't. She was a British woman. She ended up in Guyana. So she came to Guyana in 1910 because her husband was hired as a government medical officer. So he was hired by the colonial government to be a doctor in Guyana. His wife, Ethel, was a doctor. She came along with him. Her work fits the pattern of early female physicians. So she worked with women and children. She did infant welfare work in Britain and Guyana. And when she was in Guyana, she was appointed as the medical officer, so the doctor in charge of the British Guiana Baby Saving League, so an organization that sent midwives and home visitors to the homes of poor women who had recently had children. And so Ethel Minette supervise these midwives and train these midwives. So that was her role. So it's fairly typical for this period, but as I said, she is the only female health physician I've run into in this period. Okay, so how do we know this? So how do we find out any information at all about female healthcare workers in this period? Does anyone have any ideas? Like, where do you think? I don't know, who the group is, if we've got any history students among us or anyone who's interested in history, but do you have a sense of how we would know the stories of someone like an Ethel Minette or female healthcare workers in the past? You don't have any ideas? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm not a history student, but maybe from enrollment lists on medical school records, maybe some of the projects that they worked on have their names on it. So you'd get an understanding of what they did.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So enrollment records in university, absolutely. So that's one place. So you can go to McGill. I've done some research at the University of Edinburgh, for example, and you can look through the lists of people who enrolled, and you can tell. I mean, it's fairly clear from names in the past, who's a woman and who wasn't. So you can find out that way. And yeah, and you can look through. I mean, in my history of medicine course, I was often tell my students to look through journals like the British Medical Journal, for example, or the Lancet. Who wrote the articles? Doctors wrote these articles, but you can find female physicians in that period for sure. And I see a couple of people in the chat. Yeah, so someone reminded me that I mentioned the census. So census reports will tell us how many female health workers were out there. And somebody suggested medical records. Absolutely. So that's a really good suggestion as well. Okay, so if we look at this slide here, can you guys see this really clearly? So this is the cover of the Baby Saving League of the report of the Baby Saving League of British Guiana, the first report from 1914. I'm wondering, I hope the print isn't too small. Can you see any female names on that list?
Yeah, I can see a few. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a source, right? So this source, this report, the first report of the Baby Saving League in British Guiana, the first organization of its kind in the Anglophone Caribbean, one of the very first organizations of its kind in the entire British Empire. This tells us that there were women involved in the healthcare field. So because I work in this area, I know who most of these women are. Most of them were not healthcare workers. So these are the women on the committee. And so we see Dr. Manette, who is Ethel's husband, who was on the committee, but we see Mrs. Manette, MB. And when I first saw this, I'm like, oh, okay, she's but she's somebody's wife. And so she's involved in the committee because she's the husband of Dr. Manette. And I realized, oh, wait, she's a doctor as well. But in the sources, she's always referred to as Mrs. Manette, right? And it took actually a little bit of digging before I realized, in fact, yeah, she was a doctor as well. So sources like this will help us find out, will help us identify women in the past. So women, and we know about Manette because she had a pretty influential position in the colony. She was the head of this Baby Saving League. She wrote reports, she talked about her work, so we know what she did. But women like her and physicians more generally were significantly outnumbered by women of African and Asian ancestry. And these women made up most of many of the nurses and most of the midwives in the Caribbean in the period that we're talking about. But it's hard to find out information about these women because they didn't write reports like the doctors did. They didn't write other accounts. They didn't publish in the Lancet or the British Medical Journal in the period that we're talking about. But we can learn about them from what other people said about them, from the writings of other professionals, so doctors, for example, or government workers. The sources are invariably problematic. So maybe, as you can imagine, they're really racist, they're really sexist in this period, but they're still really useful. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about Caribbean nurses and midwives, what we know about them, and the work that they did. And so we know a little bit about their education, for example, and we know a little bit about something about their identity from medical reports, as someone suggested earlier. So this is an example of a medical report by the Surgeon General of Guyana, so it was formerly British Guiana when it was a colony. In places, and reports like this tell us that training schools were established in the 1890s in the British Caribbean to train local women, so women of African and increasingly of South Asian ancestry, to become nurses and to become midwives. This is a slide of the maternity hospital in Kingston, Jamaica. So it's the Victoria Jubilee Maternity Hospital. This is a place where it was established in the early 1890s. And this is where nurse or midwives were trained. It was also a place where women could go to give birth. This is another place, a slide of another place in the Caribbean where nurses could get trained. This is the almshouse, a place where poor people, the poor and the sick who didn't have homes or money could stay. This is in St. Michael Parish in Barbados. And in this almshouse, a midwifery training program was established in the early 1900s. I think it was like 1901 or 1902. So these were places where nurses could get trained and midwives would get trained. Okay. These sources, so the sources that I've been talking about tell us about the training programs and the kind of courses that women took and what the nature of the training was like. It doesn't tell us specifically about the ethnic background of nurses and midwives, but other kinds of sources do suggest that that these women probably represented the local population. So most were probably of African descent, some were of South Asian descent. And these sources also tell us the number of women who are trained. So this is one source that I've used fairly heavily in my work on Barbados. It's the report of the poor law inspector. And so this report, very dry, but super interesting. This is where I found a lot of information about the training of midwives in Barbados in the early 20th century. Okay. So women who were trained as midwives and nurses, what did they do after their training was over? They got jobs, often in places like this. So in the almshouse in Barbados, for example, they would get jobs sometimes in colonial hospitals. So here's some images of some two colonial hospitals in Guyana. So the one in New Amsterdam, a small town, and Georgetown, the capital city, and then here we go. And then the colonial hospital in Port of Spain. So women who are trained as nurses and midwives, they get jobs in places like this. Sometimes they would get jobs as private nurses, so working for private individuals. And sometimes they would get jobs working in an organization like the Baby Saving League of British Guiana. I mean, this organization, there are sort of similar ones in a few other places in the Anglophone Caribbean, but the one in Guyana was the biggest for sure. And it had, I don't know, like by the 1930s, maybe 50 chapters, something like that, 50 or 60 chapters, and each chapter employed a midwife, right? So, I mean, so this was a place where midwives could work, but they could also obviously just work for private patients. Okay, so here's, whoops, here we go. The PowerPoint just keeps kind of running back and forth sometimes. Okay, so this image shows us a group of nurses who were they're sitting outside the nursing home in Shanghai. And this is a different group of nurses, but they're also important in our story. So when you look at this image, what do you see? Like any sort of, first impressions? What do you observe? I mean, it's a little out of focus, but.
I mean, they all seem like kind of like dainty and like, I don't know, like light. They're making sure they're like really proper. Like that's what it seems to me.
Yeah, totally. Okay, yeah. They look very, very ladylike, don't they? Right? Very ladylike, very respectable. They're sitting like nobody's kind of slouched back in her chair like that. So everybody's pretty professional looking. What else can you see? What else can you see? I see a chat. Right, here we go. Yeah, they're women, they're properly dressed, absolutely. They're white.
Yeah, I was gonna say they all seem Caucasian.
Yeah, they're white, right? They're probably all European. They're all white women. So that's important. So these women were probably hospital matrons. So they had senior nursing roles in the colonial hospital in Shanghai. They probably helped train local nurses. And so they're an important group in our story as well. So in the British Caribbean, the nurses who were hired to work in the hospitals to train local women of African and Asian ancestry as nurses and midwives were white women, and they were white women from Britain. And so the fact that white women were hired to train Black women tells us a great deal about the ideology of white supremacy that existed in the Caribbean and in the colonial world in this period. And so in this period, senior government positions and senior institutional positions, leadership positions, were invariably given to white people, white men or white women, whether they were born in Britain or whether they were born in the Caribbean itself. And contemporary gender ideologies at this time meant that men, for the most part, dominated in these leadership positions and the most authoritative positions, but white English women were believed to be suitable for leadership roles in the nursing field, and especially in the area of infant welfare work. So the organization that many of these women belonged to and that brought them to the Caribbean or to parts of Africa was an organization that was called the Colonial Nursing Association. And so this is just a slide from some information about the CNA. So the Colonial Nursing Association was established in the late 1890s, and it provided trained British nurses for the British Empire, including the British Caribbean. And so, as was pointed out, these women had to fit, they had to have particular characteristics. And so they were required to be white. They were required to be British. They had to be, quote unquote, respectable and ladies and in quotation marks, and they had to be single, right? So that was important. So these were the characteristics of the British nurses who were sent to places in the Caribbean and to Africa to train local nurses. So the sources that we have, so for example, so this is, I don't know if you can see because the print is a bit small, so this is a report from the Victoria Jubilee Lying-in Hospital in Jamaica from 1902. So a report from the institution, whose picture I showed you a few minutes ago. Reports like this tell us about the role of these nurses and the kind of training that they did. But information like this, which is an application. I mean, think about when you apply for a job today, you have to, I think that there's a session right now on what professionalization and resume writing. And when we apply for jobs, we have to submit a resume. When women applied for nursing jobs in the past, if a British woman wanted to get a position in the Colonial Nursing Association, she had to fill out an application. And you can't see this, but it says, you know, when was she born? What was her age? Where was she born? Is she married, widow? Is she single, married, or a widow? And all of these women were single. So of course they didn't have children. They had to say where they went to school, where they trained, where they were born, et cetera, and they had to provide letters of reference. So a source like this tells us about these women, so the women who came to places in the Caribbean and Africa to train nurses. And a source like this also tells us what those hiring these nurses thought was important. Okay, so we can find out information about physicians and female physicians. There weren't many of them, but the sources will tell us about these women, biographical details, where they went to school, et cetera, et cetera. Sources will also tell us a bit more about white British nurses through an organization like the Colonial Nursing Association. It's a lot harder to find out information about women who did not attend the formal nurse or midwifery training programs and who weren't part of the formal healthcare field. But these women were also super important, and they actually were numerically dominant in the period that we're talking about. So I'm going to talk about this group. So the sources that tell us about this group, so this slide gives us one example of that, the report of the Baby Saving League. Sources written by physicians and other officials, they tell us about these informally trained midwives, these so-called granny midwives. These sources are, I always tell my students, sources are problematic. All sources are problematic. Sources written about midwives, informally trained midwives in the past, invariably describe them in negative terms. So they describe them as quote unquote superstitious or quote unquote dirty in very negative ways. In this time period when we see the growing acceptance by physicians of the role of germs in spreading disease and the importance of cleanliness during medical procedures, these stereotypes about midwives, about informally trained midwives, just sort of seem to accentuate these developments. And so some colonial historians have pointed out, people who've done quite a bit of work in this area have pointed out that there's probably some truth in some instances to some of these representations. And so some historians point to the fact that some informally trained midwives used unhygienic practices, and that this contributed to high rates of infant and maternal mortality, but ideas about infection built on the stereotype of the so-called filthy midwife. And obviously in quotation marks. So in the Caribbean and in other places, in not only in the colonial world, like in Africa, for example, and India, but also North America and in Britain and in Europe, midwifery training programs were designed primarily to effectively force informally trained midwives out of business because they were seen as, in some of the ways that we've just been talking about. But these informally trained midwives played an extremely important role despite these negative representations of them. So in the period of slavery and the post-slavery years, most informally trained midwives in the Caribbean were women of African descent. This is the case in the Anglophone Caribbean. By the late 19th century, we see that there were increasing numbers of women of South Asian birth or ancestry who were also working as informally trained so-called granny midwives. This is especially the case in a place like Guyana and Trinidad, which had large numbers of immigrants from these parts of the world. And the sources show us clearly that poor women in the Caribbean turned to the growing number of trained midwives as the 20th century progressed, but they also show us that women continue to use these so-called grannies as well. So women are using both kinds of healthcare workers, the growing number of formally trained midwives and nurses, but they're also using the large number of informally trained workers, these so-called grannies. Does anyone have any ideas why that might have been the case? And so we can sort of think about this period as one historian of history of health and medicine has sort of talked about this period as sort of like a medical marketplace, right? Where people would choose different healthcare workers. They'll turn to this healthcare worker or they'll turn to that one. What kind of factors may have determined those choices, do you think? Well, cost was certainly one factor, right? So traditional midwives, informally trained midwives may well have been cheaper. They may have been, these informally trained midwives and their patients may have been able to bargain or barter over the amount that they had to be paid. Maybe the grannies were able to accept payment in forms other than cash. So they may have been cheaper. They may have had a more flexible payment system. They also, informally trained midwives may have been seen as less foreign, as in more familiar. So if you can imagine formally trained and certified midwives and nurses, regardless of their ethnicity, may well have been seen as foreign. And so informally trained midwives are probably well known in the community where they practice. People would have known them. Their birthing methods were probably very familiar to their mostly Afro-Creole and South Asian descendant clientele. Formally trained midwives, on the other hand, were seen as foreign in a number of ways. Number one, they were literate. They had to be literate because they had to go to a training program. They had to write up their case reports. And even though rates of literacy in the Anglophone Caribbean were, high-ish in this period. I mean, in Jamaica, maybe 60% of men and women could read and write, maybe 50%, in Guyana, but that's still a significant proportion of the population was not literate in standard English. And so the fact that formally trained midwives use standard English and were literate may have made them seem different or foreign to their patient population. The second factor is that they were sort of respectable in quotation marks. And so what did that mean? Respectable in the Anglophone Caribbean in this time period referred to men and women who were seen as manifesting a number of sort of social and cultural characteristics. So they were Christian, for example. They were they didn't drink. They were chaste, or they were monogamous. They were married in a church, and so they had a number of. They engaged in a number of social practices and were seen as having a number of characteristics, and were seen as being sort of culturally distant from the vast majority of the African descendant and the South Asian descendant population, who had different kinds of cultural and social practices. Certainly this was the case among the non-elite section of the population. And third, trained midwives were seen as foreign because they were advocating sort of elite birthing and childbearing practices. So, and this is manifested in a number of ways. So for example, in Guyana, if a woman was trained as a midwife, went to one of these training programs, she had to wear a uniform. So the uniform kind of indicated her position. She was a formally trained midwife, not an informally trained midwife. She had a bag, her midwife bag, where she had all of her tools. She had a sign plate that she could put outside her house that said, formally trained midwife, registered, et cetera, et cetera. So she had, and she had a certificate, right? So all of these material items showed that these women had gone to a formal training program, and these material items demonstrated their foreignness. Some non-elite women may have found that appealing. Many non-elite women may have found that off-putting. They may have been not willing to use these formally trained healthcare workers because they were seen as using practices that these women were not that familiar with. But I mean, what's so interesting in this period, though, I mean, so we have that going on, right? But what's super interesting is that at the same time, because informally trained midwives numerically dominated, they were far more numerous than were formally trained midwives. Colonial governments in the region, in fact, had to try to find a way to incorporate them into the formal medical system. And so we see this, especially in Guyana, it happened much earlier, and then increasingly, so in the early, like 1902, the government of Guyana passed a law that said, okay, traditional grannies, informally trained midwives, could be registered and they could become part of the formal healthcare system, even though they didn't go to midwifery school. Something similar happens in Trinidad a few years later. Jamaica in the 1810s. And so in order to get this recognition, these so-called grannies had to do a couple of things. They had to have been practicing for at least a couple of years. They had to prove that, quote, they had to prove their knowledge of simple labor, in quotation marks, and they had to demonstrate, quote, their fitness to continue in the profession. And a physician had to approve of their fitness, and he basically had to give his approval. And I mean, so this reflected, I mean, this is super interesting because it tells us that even though informally trained midwives were condemned in the ways that we've talked about, and all the sort of the sexist and racist ways that we've just noted, they were seen as important because there were so many of them. And if physicians and government officials wanted women to see midwives, and if they wanted to control the practice of childbirth, they had to try and exert some kind of control and some kind of oversight over informally trained midwives as well. And it also shows us that just by being there, just by working, and informally trained midwives in effect forced the government to recognize their role. And because ordinary women continue to use informally trained midwives, they forced governments to recognize the roles of informally trained midwives. So I think that this is like a super interesting development in this period. Okay, so I'll sum up and then see if anybody has any questions. So I've done a couple of things in this talk. Number one, primarily we've been talking about the role that female healthcare workers played in the Anglophone Caribbean in the late 19th and the early 20th century. I tried to place this within a larger context in the colonial world. And what I've also tried to do is to tell you about some of the sources that we use and that historians can use to learn about who these women were, to learn a little bit about their stories and their lives. And even though these sources are problematic, they can really tell us quite a bit about what people were doing in the past and who these people were. And I'm gonna leave it there, but if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. So thanks very much. So I think I'm gonna stop. No, I'm going to keep sharing in case anybody wants to look at these slides more. Okay, questions from anyone? And I see there's some things in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. de Barros. We're now going to open the floor up for discussion. So if anyone has questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand. Or since we're such a small group, you can probably just turn your mic on and ask.
Yeah, totally.
I'll actually get it started.
Okay, thanks.
So today we're discussing the global evolution of healthcare as our wide theme, and the globalization of healthcare, which I'm sure a lot of that is based in colonization. Um, and you mentioned that many Caribbean healthcare workers on different levels faced massive barriers related to racism and sexism, et cetera, through various examples. How would you say that has evolved with time from the early 20th century, excuse me, and how do aspects of that remain in how healthcare works in the Caribbean and around the world today?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that we can certainly see, I think that we can obviously see the reality of racism and sexism in the world that we exist today in today, and that these factors present obstacles to women who want to work in these professions. But we also see, though, that women play. I mean, that's why I think the quotation by Alfred Stiles, by the head of the American Medical Association in the late 19th century, about how ill-suited women are for medicine is so extraordinary, because we have only to look around the world today and we see the incredible role that women play as healthcare workers. I mean, Bonnie Henry in British Columbia has a shoe named after her, right? I mean, these women are, Eileen Davila, I think there's a Facebook group or a Facebook site devoted to her scarf, because she wears these really cool scarves. So these women are, I mean, they're icons, really. People look up to them. They're the spokespeople right now. And probably everybody in this group has a female physician, or at least knows a female physician. So female healthcare workers they're omnipresent. They play an incredibly important role, despite the ongoing reality of sexism and racism in the period, in the modern day period. I mean, one of the super interesting things about Caribbean healthcare workers and nurses, especially in the history of Canada, is some of the early waves of Caribbean immigrants who came to Canada were nurses, right? And so they were allowed to come into Canada. They worked as nurses. And so there were, like by the 1970s, significant numbers of Caribbean nurses in Canada. In Great Britain, large numbers of Caribbean nurses went to Britain to train, yeah, but also to work, because salaries were higher. And those places, they faced racism, as we can imagine, but they played an incredibly important role in the health field in these places, for sure. One of my colleagues, Karen Flynn, has done fantastic work on the immigration of Caribbean nurses from the Caribbean to Canada. It's super interesting work if anybody's interested in checking out that stuff.
We actually have a question in the chat.
Yep.
Christina asks, how did your interest in this subject develop?
Oh man, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a great question. Gosh, I mean, I've been working on sort of the history of medicine and public health in the Caribbean since I started to do my doctoral dissertation work, like in the 1990s. I initially started off as an urban historian, actually, and I went to Guyana, to Georgetown, because that was what I was going to do my dissertation on, and I did. But when you're an urban historian working in the late 19th century, boy, were people in the past fascinated by public health problems and sanitation. And I just found like all of these reports dealing with public health and sanitation, and I just found it super fascinating. Some of the first reports I found were actually this one here, the Baby Saving League. I just stumbled into some of these reports in a warehouse in Georgetown. They were just all kind of stacked up, and I found like all of these reports by women who work for the Baby Saving League, these home visitors, as they were called, and these women talking about their contact with poor women in Georgetown, and these women, their experiences in their homes and giving birth, and all kinds of stuff like that. So I ran these sources and I found them super interesting. And over the years, I've been digging into them more and more. And then I started to work on Barbados, and I found a very different kind of pattern in Barbados, and I became interested in just sort of comparing what was happening in different parts of the Caribbean. So yeah, I mean, the work on female healthcare workers and infant welfare, which I've done quite a bit of work on, came out of my interest really in sort of public health and sanitation. It's like, and then, you know, you read the sources and it's like, hey, this doesn't make sense. This is kind of curious. And then next thing you know, you've written a book about it. So, but that's a great question.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone wants to contribute.
Okay.
Hi, it's not really a question, but it's sort of, I was just thinking about when you were talking about how that one woman wasn't considered, like, written down, you know, Dr. So-and-so. And I was just, it was reminding me of today how we have that same issue, like women not being referred to as doctor of whatever, whether it's medicine or philosophy. And so it was just really interesting when you touched on that, because I've been thinking about that a lot lately. So I was like, wow.
Yeah, there was, I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I mean, because that was so crazy. Eh? When I first started to find the information about her, because sometimes it didn't have like MD, Bachelor of Medicine after her name. It just had like Mrs. Minette. And then sometimes I would see like Dr. Mrs. Minette, but I'd also see Dr. Minette with different initials. And I was like super confused. It was ridiculous, but I was really puzzled. And it took me actually quite a while to figure out who she was, because she had a husband who was a medical doctor with the same surname, but her initials are different because she was Edith. And I'm like, wait. But I remember digging through the sources, like thinking, what the heck is going on? And when I finally realized, oh man, she's a doctor and she's married to this guy. And all of a sudden, everything fell into place. But because of how she was referred to, because nobody really, hardly any sources referred to as Dr. Ethel Minette, right? And so we didn't really know. And then actually I was talking to one of my colleagues, a friend who works at York, and she said apparently this physician, Dr. Ethel Minette, she ended up in Hong Kong. So after she left Guyana, she went to Hong Kong because her husband went there. And I've been trying to find more information about her, but I haven't been able to. But they're like classic examples of doctors who just kind of move around the world in this period, right? But what makes her so unusual is that she's a woman. And I really, you know, kind of reflected a lot of the stereotypical, well, the views of her time, you know, negative views about people of African descent, highly critical of informally trained midwives, but a super influential person and really, really interesting. And I'd love to find a picture of her, but the internet will not allow me to do that.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for this workshop today. Big thank you to you, Dr. de Barros, for that
You're welcome.
talk and for facilitating some really interesting conversation about then and now, and about that doctor that you were mentioning. And I now really want to see her picture as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much for this. This is great. And thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
For our attendees, if you'd like to continue to attend the International Women in Science Day Conference 2021, we've linked the next event, the Gender Stereotypes panel, in the chat, or you can find all the links for that in the email you may have received and on all of our social medias. So we're going to close out there and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye. Oops.